Before you go, tell me, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to know how far these forgotten stories are reaching. And if this story made you stop and think, even for a moment, hit that subscribe button. November 16th, 1944. The Hürtgen forest had no mercy left. The trees stood like blackened teeth against a gray sky, their branches shattered by weeks of artillery. Snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes, covering the dead and the living without distinction. The cold was not the kind that made you shiver. It was the kind that made you stop feeling altogether. Private First Class Leon Washington crouched in the dark corner of what used to be a barn. 3 walls still stood. The roof was gone. Through the gap above, he could see smoke rising from the American line 50 meters away. Foxholes dug into frozen earth. Men hunched inside them like animals waiting for winter to end. It wouldn't end, not here. Lee's hands were wrapped in strips of torn undershirt, but the cold still bit through. He held his grandmother's cast-iron skillet in his lap, running his thumb over the dent near the handle. Shrapnel from Omaha Beach, 5 months ago. It felt like 5 years. The skillet was all he had left of Georgia. That, and a recipe card folded in his breast pocket so worn the ink had faded to ghosts. He exhaled slowly. His breath hung in the air like a question. From the foxholes, voices drifted through the trees. Low, angry. Men who had stopped whispering because they no longer cared who heard. 3 weeks of this frozen shit, can't even feel my feet anymore. They want us to attack tomorrow with what? Lee closed his eyes. He knew that tone. He had heard it before, back in Georgia during the Depression. Men on the edge. Men who had run out of everything except rage. Then came the boots, heavy, deliberate. Lee looked up. Sergeant Kowalski stood in the doorway of the barn, silhouetted against the pale light. He was a big man, Polish stock, with a jaw like an anvil and eyes that had seen too much. He didn't salute, didn't speak right away, just stood there, steam rising from his shoulders. Finally, he stepped inside. Lee, Sergeant. Kowalski glanced at the skillet, then back at Lee's face. You planning to cook something with that or just hold it till the war ends? Lee didn't smile. Waiting on supplies, Sergeant. Same as everyone. Supplies. Kowalski spat the word like a curse. He crouched down, knees cracking, and lowered his voice. Listen to me, Washington. The men are done. You hear me? Done. Lee said nothing. They've been eating frozen sea rations for 8 days, Kowalski continued. Their fingers are black. Their feet are worse. Half of them can't load a rifle without dropping the clip. And tomorrow, he leaned closer. Tomorrow, Captain Reese is going to order them to attack that ridge. Lee's jaw tightened. He knew the ridge. Everyone knew it. A German strongpoint dug in, fortified. Suicide. That's the order, Lee said quietly. Yeah. Kowalski's eyes were hard. And you know what's going to happen when he gives it? Silence. They're going to tell him no. The word hung in the frozen air between them. Mutiny. Lee felt his pulse quicken. In the U.S. Army, refusal to follow orders in combat wasn't just a crime. It was a death sentence. Firing squad, no trial, no mercy. Kowalski stood slowly, his shadow stretching across the dirt floor. I'm not asking you to fix the war, Lee. I'm asking you to give them one reason not to walk away, just one. Lee looked down at the skillet in his hands. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, soft and steady. A man who's hungry can't think straight, but a man who's fed can face anything. What do you want me to do? Lee asked. Kowalski stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked toward the door. He paused at the threshold, his back to Lee. Whatever you can. And then he was gone. Lee sat alone in the ruined barn, the skillet cold and heavy in his lap. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the broken timbers. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like a distant heartbeat. He thought about the jeep parked 30 meters away, the one with the fuel can strapped to the side. Fuel meant for evacuation. Fuel he had no authorization to touch. He thought about the men in the foxholes. Men who had fought beside him from Normandy to here. Men who had stopped believing in anything except cold and death. And he thought about the order that would come tomorrow. The order that would break them. Lee stood slowly. He tucked the skillet under his arm and stepped out into the snow. The forest was silent, the kind of silence that came before something terrible. He walked toward the jeep. 3 days earlier, November 13th, 1944, the Hürtgen forest wasn't supposed to be this hard. On the maps back in London, it looked like any other stretch of German border. Trees, hills, a few villages. Clear it, move on, end the war by Christmas. But maps lie. The forest was a killing ground. Every tree hid a German machine gun nest. Every trail was mined. Every ridge concealed artillery. The 28th Infantry Division, called the Bloody Bucket for the Keystone patch on their shoulders, had been grinding through these woods for 2 weeks. They had gained less than 3 miles, and the cost, over 6,000 men, dead, wounded, missing, or simply gone. Swallowed by the mud and snow and darkness, Company K was what remained of a full-strength rifle company. On paper, they numbered 120 men. In reality, there were maybe 80 still capable of holding a rifle. The rest were in aid stations, frozen in foxholes, or buried under snow waiting for graves registration to find them. Morale wasn't just low, it was gone. The problem wasn't courage. These men had landed at Normandy. They had fought through the hedgerows of France. They knew how to kill and how to survive. The problem was logistics. The supply line into the Hürtgen forest was a single road, barely wide enough for one truck. It snaked through a valley the Germans had registered with every artillery piece in the sector. Convoys that tried to run it during daylight were destroyed. Convoys that tried at night got lost, bogged down, or ambushed. On November 8th, the last supply truck reached Company K. It carried ammunition, medical supplies, and one hot meal cooked at a rear depot 12 miles away. The men devoured it in silence, savoring every bite of warm stew and fresh bread. It was the last time they tasted heat. Since then, they had survived on sea rations, small tin cans of meat, crackers, and jam designed to keep a man alive, not make him want to stay that way. In summer, sea rations were bland. In the Hürtgen winter, they were frozen solid. Men tried heating them over candles, over small fires made from twigs and diesel. Some just chipped away at the frozen contents with their knives and chewed until their jaws ached. It wasn't enough. Captain Rees, the company commander, knew it. He had sent 3 requests to battalion headquarters for resupply. Each time, the answer was the same. Convoy en route, hold your position. But the convoys never came. On the morning of November 15th, Rees tried again. He sat in a dugout that served as his command post. A field telephone pressed to his ear, his breath steaming in the dim light. "Sir, my men haven't had a hot meal in 7 days, he said, forcing his voice to stay calm. "They're on the edge. I need—" The voice on the other end cut him off, clipped, impatient. "Captain, every unit in this sector is on the edge. You think you're special?" Rees's jaw tightened. "Sir, I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for basic—" "There's a convoy being assembled now. Should reach you by tomorrow evening." Hope flickered. "Confirmed?" "Affirmative. Hot food, fuel, medical supplies. Just hold your position one more day." Rees exhaled. "Understood. Thank you, sir. One more thing, Captain." "Sir." "Your attack order stands. 0600 tomorrow. You will take that ridge." The line went dead. Rees sat in the silence of the dugout, staring at the telephone in his hand. Outside, he could hear the wind howling through the shattered trees. Somewhere in the distance, a man coughed, deep, wet, the sound of lungs giving out. He knew what that attack order meant. Sending men up that ridge without rest, without warmth, without hope. It was murder dressed up as duty, but orders were orders. That night, the radio in the command post crackled to life. Static, then a voice, faint and broken. "Convoy, ambush, Schmidt Road, total loss." Rees grabbed the handset. "Say again. Repeat your last." More static. Then nothing. He tried 3 more times. Silence. The convoy wasn't coming. Rees sat back, the handset still in his hand, and stared at the dirt wall of the dugout. He had no food to give his men, no hope to offer, just an order to attack at dawn. And somewhere out there, in a ruined barn, a cook named Lee Washington was making a decision that would change everything. Leon Washington was born in 1912 in a town so small it didn't have a name on most maps. Just a crossroads in rural Georgia, where red dirt met pine trees and poverty was the only thing anyone had in common. His father worked the railroad, his mother took in laundry, and his grandmother, Mama Ada, ran a kitchen that fed half the county. Not because she had money, but because she refused to let anyone go hungry. Lee grew up in that kitchen. By age 8, he could bone a chicken in under 2 minutes. By 10, he knew how to stretch a pound of flour into enough biscuits to feed 12 people. By 12, he understood something most men never learned. Cooking wasn't just about following recipes. It was about reading what you had and making it enough. "Ain't about what you got," Mama Ada used to say, her hands working dough like clay. "It's about what you do with it." She taught him to taste with his eyes, to smell when bread was 30 seconds from burning, to know that a pinch of salt could save a pot of beans, and too much could ruin a week's worth of food. But she also taught him something else. One summer, during the Depression, a group of white men came through town. Drifters, hungry, dangerous. They sat on the porch of Mama Ada's house and demanded food. Lee, 13 years old, watched from the kitchen window as his grandmother brought out a pot of stew and a stack of cornbread. She didn't smile, didn't speak, just set it down and walked back inside. Later, Lee asked her why. They were going to take it anyway, she said. This way, they took it as a gift, not a theft, but they didn't deserve it. Mama Ada looked at him, her eyes steady. Baby, feeding people ain't about deserve. It's about dignity, theirs and yours. Lee never forgot that. He tried to get work after high school. Applied to every diner, every restaurant, every kitchen in 3 counties. The answer was always the same. We don't hire coloreds for the front, so he worked construction. He loaded trucks. He did whatever kept his mother fed and his dignity intact. When the war came, he enlisted, not because he believed in flags or speeches, but because the army didn't care what color you were when it came to needing bodies. They made him a cook, mess duty, the job nobody wanted. Lee didn't mind. He had learned a long time ago that feeding people was power. Not loud power, not the kind that wore medals, but the kind that kept men moving when everything else told them to stop. Now, in the frozen hell of the Hürtgen forest, Lee stood in a shattered barn with nothing but a cast-iron skillet, a faded recipe card, and a terrible choice. He pulled the card from his pocket. His grandmother's handwriting, faint now, almost gone. The recipe for her biscuits: flour, lard, salt, buttermilk. Simple, perfect. He didn't have buttermilk, didn't have fresh lard, didn't have a working stove. But he had something else. He had hands that remembered. Lee tucked the card back into his pocket and looked at the Jeep parked 30 meters away. 5 fuel cans strapped to the side. Fuel meant for evacuation. Fuel he had no permission to touch. If he used it, he could build a fire, he could cook, he could feed the men, and he could be court-martialed. He thought about Sergeant Kowalski's words, give them one reason not to walk away. He thought about the men in the foxholes, too cold to think, too hungry to care. He thought about Mama Ada. Feeding people ain't about deserve, it's about dignity. Lee walked to the Jeep. His boots crunched in the snow, his breath hung in the frozen air. He reached for the first fuel can, his hands didn't shake. Lee worked through the night. He dragged 2 spent 105mm artillery shell casings from a debris pile near the foxholes. Each one was nearly 3 feet long, blackened, still warm from old powder burns. He stacked them end to end, then sealed the connection with mud and clay scraped from the frozen ground. It looked like something a child would build, but Lee had learned from his father, if it holds heat, it works. He wedged flat stones inside the bottom casing to create an elevated floor. That would allow airflow underneath, critical for sustaining a fire without choking it. Then he poured a thin layer of Jeep fuel into the base and added pine resin he'd collected from shattered trees. The resin would burn slow, hot, long. He struck a match. The fire caught instantly, roaring to life inside the makeshift stove. Flames licked upward through the gap between the casings. Smoke poured out in thick black clouds, too much smoke. Lee cursed under his breath and adjusted the airflow, packing mud tighter around the seams. The smoke thinned. The fire settled into a steady, crackling burn. He had heat. Now he needed a cooking surface. He salvaged German mess tin lids from the abandoned dugout 400 meters northeast, a dangerous trip but necessary. He flattened them with a rock, wired them together, and suspended the makeshift griddle above the fire using a rifle cleaning rod wedged between 2 stones. By dawn, Lee had a functioning field stove. He stood back, hands black with soot, and allowed himself a small moment of pride. Then Captain Reese walked in. What the hell is this? Lee turned. Reese stood in the barn doorway, his arms crossed, his face carved from stone. Behind him, 2 other officers peered over his shoulder. Field stove, sir, Lee said. For cooking. Reese stepped closer, circling the contraption like a wolf eyeing wounded prey. He nudged one of the artillery casings with his boot. It wobbled slightly. You built this? Yes, sir. With what authorization? Lee hesitated. None, sir, but the men, Reese interrupted, will eat what they're issued, when they're issued it. Sir, they haven't had a hot meal in over a week. If I can just— You can what, Washington? Reese's voice dropped, cold and sharp. You think this Negro voodoo contraption is going to solve anything? The words landed like a slap. One of the officers behind Reese chuckled. Not loud, just enough. Lee said nothing. His jaw tightened, but his face remained still. Reese crouched beside the stove, peering inside. You used fuel from the Jeep. Yes, sir. That fuel is for emergency evacuation. Sir, the men are starving. You thought wrong. Reese stood, brushing ash from his gloves. Dismantle this, now. Lee felt his chest tighten. Captain, if you just let me try. That's an order, Private. Silence filled the barn. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Somewhere distant, artillery thumped. Lee looked at the stove, at the fire still burning inside. At the hours of work that had gone into something the officers saw as a joke, he nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." Reese turned to leave, then paused. "And Washington? Next time you want to play cook, get permission first." The officers left. Lee stood alone. He didn't dismantle the stove, not yet. Instead, he decided to prove it worked. He pulled out 2 pounds of flour from the emergency stores, unauthorized, but he was already past that line, and began mixing dough for biscuits. He worked carefully, flour, lard, water. His hands remembered the rhythm, fold, press, fold. But the clay seal around the stove had cracked from the heat. Lee hadn't noticed. The fire spread. Flames licked out through the gap, caught the edge of a burlap sack, and flared upward. Lee lunged forward, smothering it with his jacket. The fire died, but the damage was done. 2 pounds of flour, wasted, burned, gone. Lee sat in the ash, staring at his blackened hands. Behind him, he heard boots. He turned. Sergeant Kowalski stood in the doorway, watching. "They're not going to let you do this," Kowalski said quietly. Lee didn't answer. "But if you try again," Kowalski continued, "and it works, I'll make sure they can't stop you." Lee looked up. "And if it doesn't work?" Kowalski's face was unreadable. "Then we're all dead anyway." He left. Lee sat alone in the ruined barn, surrounded by ash and failure, the cast-iron skillet cold beside him. Outside, the men waited, hungry, hopeless, and tomorrow they would be ordered to die. November 16th, 1944, 1400 hours. Lee rebuilt the stove in silence. This time, he sealed the artillery casings with a mixture of wet clay and ash, packing it thick around every seam. He tested the airflow 3 times before lighting the fire. When the flames caught, he watched for smoke. Clean, steady, it would hold. But he had a bigger problem. The flour was gone. The lard was nearly depleted, and he had no ingredients left in the American supply stores. If he wanted to feed over 80 men, he would have to go back to the German dugout. In daylight, Lee grabbed his rifle and moved through the trees. The snow had stopped, but the cold remained, biting through his thin jacket. Every branch snapped like a gunshot under his boots. Every shadow could be an enemy patrol. The dugout was partially collapsed, half buried in frozen earth. Lee slid inside, rifle first. Empty. He exhaled. Wooden crates lined the walls, most of them shattered by shell fire. Lee pried them open one by one. Inside, potatoes, sacks of them, sprouted and half-frozen but edible. Jars of sauerkraut sealed tight and wrapped in waxed paper. Speck, German smoked bacon, cured and dense with fat. Enough to feed a company. Lee loaded everything into a canvas sack and hauled it back through the forest. His shoulders burned. His fingers went numb. But he didn't stop. By 1600 hours, he was back at the barn. Now came the hard part. Lee sliced the potatoes thin, layering them in the salvaged German mess tins. He diced the speck, rendering the fat slowly over the fire until it pooled golden and rich. The smell, smoky, savory, alive, drifted through the barn and into the forest beyond. Men in the foxholes stirred. Heads lifted, noses twitched. Someone whispered, "Do you smell that?" Lee worked faster. He mixed the remaining flour with snow-melt water and lard, kneading it into rough dough. No buttermilk, no baking powder, just his hands and his grandmother's memory guiding him. He shaped the dough into small rounds and placed them on the hot griddle. They sizzled, browning slowly. Biscuits. The potatoes cooked in the bacon fat, turning golden at the edges. He added the sauerkraut, letting the acidity cut through the richness. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't regulation, but it was food. Real food, hot food, and it was enough. By 1730 hours, the meal was ready. Lee stood back, sweat dripping despite the cold, and stared at what he had made. Tin plates lined the barn floor, each one filled with fried potatoes, bacon, sauerkraut, and 2 biscuits. 83 plates, one for every man still standing. Then he heard boots. Captain Reese appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 lieutenants. His face was hard, his eyes scanning the barn. When he saw the stove, the food, the plates, his expression darkened. "Washington," Lee turned, his hands still greasy. "Sir, I gave you an order." "Yes, sir." "And you disobeyed it." Lee met his gaze. No fear, no defiance, just truth. "Yes, sir, I did." Reese stepped closer. "Do you understand what you've done? You stole fuel. You used unauthorized rations. You ignored a direct command." "Yes, sir. That's court-martial, Washington. That's prison, maybe worse." Lee nodded slowly. "I know, sir." Reese stared at him, jaw working. The barn was silent except for the crackling fire. Then from outside, a voice called out, "Captain!" Sergeant Kowalski appeared, his face flushed. Behind him, a dozen men stood in the snow, rifles slung, eyes locked on the barn. "Permission to speak, sir," Kowalski said. Reese turned, denied. Kowalski ignored him and pointed at Lee. "That man just gave us a reason to stay alive. You want to court-martial him? Fine, but you do it after we eat." Reese's face went red. "Sergeant, you are out of..." "Sir," another voice. Private Callahan from 3rd Squad. He stepped forward, hands shaking from cold and something deeper. "If you take him, you take all of us." More men emerged from the foxholes, 10, 20, 30. One by one, they lined the edge of the barn, standing in silence. Reese looked at them, at the food, at Lee. The captain's hand twitched toward his sidearm, then stopped. He exhaled slowly, a long breath that carried something Lee couldn't name. Defeat, or maybe just exhaustion. "Fine," Reese said quietly. "Feed them." He turned and walked out into the snow. The barn erupted. Men surged forward, not with violence but with something worse, desperation. They lined up in silence, hands trembling as Lee passed out the plates. No one spoke, no one joked, they just ate. Some wept. Others closed their eyes, chewing slowly, savoring every bite like it was the last thing they would ever taste. One soldier, a kid from Iowa, no older than 19, whispered, "Thank you," over and over until his voice broke. Sergeant Kowalski took his plate and sat against the barn wall. He ate in silence, staring at nothing. When he finished, he walked over to Lee and held out his hand. Lee shook it. Kowalski said nothing. He didn't need to. By 1900 hours, every plate was empty. The men returned to their foxholes, not with hope exactly, but with something close. Warmth, strength, a reason to hold a rifle one more day. Lee sat alone in the barn, his back against the artillery casing stove, his grandmother's cast-iron skillet resting beside him. He had disobeyed orders, stolen fuel, risked everything, and he had fed them. Outside, the forest was silent, but for the first time in weeks it didn't feel like a graveyard, it felt like a home. November 17th, 1944, 600 hours. The men of Company K rose from their foxholes in the dark. For the first time in 2 weeks they moved without hesitation. Their hands were steady on their rifles, their eyes were clear. The attack order came, and they followed it, not because they feared punishment, but because they had been given something to fight for. Themselves. The assault on the ridge lasted 4 hours. It was brutal. Machine gun fire tore through the trees. Mortars cratered the frozen ground. Men fell, screaming, bleeding into the snow. But Company K did not break. They advanced meter by meter, covering each other, calling out targets, moving with a coordination that had seemed impossible just 1 day before. Sergeant Kowalski led from the front, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. By 1,000 hours, the ridge was theirs. 12 Americans dead, 23 wounded. But the position held. Captain Reese stood at the crest of the ridge, breathing hard, his uniform torn and blood-stained. He looked back at his men, exhausted, battered, but alive, and for the first time in weeks he allowed himself to feel something other than dread. Then he walked back to the barn. Lee was cleaning the stove when Reese arrived. The captain stood in the doorway, silent, watching. Finally, he spoke. "You disobeyed a direct order." Lee straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "Yes, sir. You stole fuel. You used unauthorized rations. You put this entire unit at risk." "Yes, sir." Reese stepped inside. His voice was quieter now. "And you saved them." Lee said nothing. Reese looked at the artillery casing stove, still warm, still functional. "How did you know it would work?" "I didn't, sir." "Then why do it?" Lee met his eyes. "Because they needed it." Reese was silent for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it out. "This came in this morning. From battalion." Lee took it. His hands were still greasy. The paper was a field commendation form, stamped and signed, for initiative under adverse conditions, for maintaining unit cohesion through improvised logistics, for exemplary service. Lee stared at it. "Sir, I don't understand." "Kowalski wrote it," Reese said quietly. "Half the company signed it, even the lieutenants who laughed at you." Lee looked up. Reese's face was stone, but something flickered behind his eyes. "I'm not going to court-martial you, Washington. I'm going to recommend you for promotion." "Sir, don't." Reese held up a hand. "Just don't." He turned to leave, then paused. "That stove. Can you teach someone else to build it?" Lee nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." "Good, because word's already spreading. 2 other companies want to know how you did it." And with that, Reese walked out into the cold. 3 weeks later, Lee's improvised stove design spread through the 28th Infantry Division like wildfire. Mechanics modified it. Quartermasters logged it. Field kitchens began requisitioning artillery casings specifically for conversion. By December, similar systems appeared in other units across the Hürtgen forest. By January, Engineers at supply depots were manufacturing portable field stoves based on Lee's original blueprint, though his name never appeared in the official documentation. It didn't matter. The men knew. In February 1945, as the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, a young logistics officer named Patterson wrote a memo to division headquarters. It was brief, clinical, unadorned. Morale-sustaining field cooking systems improvised under combat conditions have reduced desertion rates and improved combat effectiveness by an estimated 18%. Recommend formal adoption and training. The recommendation was approved. By war's end, thousands of soldiers had eaten meals cooked on stoves built from salvaged artillery shells, sealed with mud, fueled by desperation and ingenuity. They called them Hürtgen stoves. Some called them Washington Specials. Lee never knew. April 1946, Atlanta, Georgia. Leon Washington stepped off the bus in a city he barely recognized. The war was over. The uniform was packed away. He carried one duffel bag and his grandmother's cast-iron skillet, still dented, still faithful. He tried finding work, applied to restaurants, hotels, diners. The answers were the same as before the war. We don't hire coloreds for the front. So Lee opened his own place, a small cinder block building on the edge of town. No sign at first, just smoke rising from a chimney and the smell of slow-cooked pork drifting into the street. He called it Lee's BBQ. He never advertised, never spoke about the war. But men came, veterans mostly, white and black alike. They sat at his tables and ate in silence, and sometimes, just sometimes, someone would look at the dented skillet hanging on the wall and ask, "Where'd you serve?" Lee would smile, here and there, that was all. 1983. Leon Washington died quietly in his sleep at age 71. His funeral was small. His children spoke. His grandchildren wept. A few old soldiers showed up, men with gray hair and canes who stood in the back and said nothing. One of them, a man named Kowalski, bent now, his voice a rasp, placed a letter on Lee's casket. It was worn, creased, yellowed with age. Inside, written in his mother's hand, "Dear Sergeant Kowalski, thank you for writing. I don't know who this cook is that you mention, but I thank God for him every night. He saved my son. Please tell him a mother's gratitude has no end." Kowalski never got the chance, but he kept the letter. And when he died 3 years later, it was buried with him. Epilogue. There is no statue of Leon Washington, no memorial in the Hürtgen forest. His name does not appear in the major histories of World War II, but in a military archive in Maryland, there is a faded memo from 1945. And in a dozen field manuals published after the war, there is a brief section on improvised cooking systems under combat conditions. And in Atlanta, on the edge of a neighborhood that has changed 100 times since 1946, there is a small BBQ joint. It's been renovated, modernized. But on the wall behind the counter there hangs a cast-iron skillet, dented, old, loved. And if you ask the owner, Lee's grandson, about it, he'll tell you a story about a man who fed hope when there was nothing left to eat. Sometimes survival is as simple as breaking bread. Sometimes heroism looks like a man who refuses to let others go hungry. And sometimes the most important battles are fought not with guns, but with fire and food and the stubborn belief that dignity matters, even in hell. What would you have done in Lee's place? Would you have followed orders, or would you have fed them? Share this story. Remember the forgotten soldiers. Remember, and never underestimate the power of a hot meal.